after the Trump-proof Seattle coalition that Transit Riders Union helped to coordinate, and many other organizations were part of, won the tax on high-income households that was subsequently litigated. And I assume that everyone knows something about that. Happy to say more if needed. But that fall of 2017, we helped to put together Coalition Housing for All that helped to get the first modern big business tax proposal out there. And that was with the help of Kirsten Harris-Talley, who was appointed as an interim council member, and Mike O'Brien. But that proposal that fall was only $25 million a year. And so it was really in 2018 that through the work of the Progressive Revenue Task Force and the Housing for All Coalition and Shamla's folks, that got bumped up to 75 million. And then what actually passed was 47 million. So that background, I think, just helps to kind of underscore how big a deal it is that we've got this tax passed this year at, I think, probably $240 or $250 million total. The city's not sure because they don't know how much the higher tax rate for Amazon, probably just Amazon, but very big businesses will bring in. So it's really awesome. And at the same time, we're not out of the woods yet. So I just wanted to say a few words about the things that could still go wrong. The council passed the legislation on last Monday. And the mayor has 10 days, I believe, in which she can decide to sign or not sign or veto the legislation. And it's true that we have a supermajority, so the council can override a mayoral veto. But I don't know, I'm not going to feel entirely secure until the legislation actually becomes law. I don't think that it's going to be easy for the mayor to peel off a vote or two, so I think we're pretty safe. But she did an interview on KUOW last Friday that was concerning in her raising all kinds of spurious objections to the policy, but also including kind of legal doubts, which is really kind of bad form for the mayor to be publicly raising legal doubts about a piece of legislation that the city's working on, especially when they're groundless. So that's a little bit annoying, and it does raise the specter of lawsuits, which I think is something that we do have to expect in one danger coming down. Like, I don't think that the city would lose a lawsuit on this tax, but it could certainly throw a little wrench in the works where it would give the mayor an excuse, like, not to actually spend the revenue that has been earmarked to spend this year. So we could see an ongoing kind of power struggle about actually implementing the tax, even though it has been passed. And I think lawsuits could play a role in that. So that's just something to keep an eye on. The other danger, of course, is a referendum. I haven't heard any whisperings about a referendum from people that we talk to that might hear something from the business side of things. So I think we're fairly safe on that front. I guess the last thing I wanted to say about dangers is just that there's been a lot of news since the tax passed about kind of people speculating about, like, oh, Amazon's going to move to Bellevue, Amazon's going to move, out of Seattle. And, and I think that that's, obviously they're not going to totally move, but the idea that they might try to change the locations of a great number of their employees to avoid a tax, I think that's a real thing, like, that they might do. Especially some of their highest paid executives. There was an article in the Puget Sound Business Journal saying that like a couple of their highly paid executives make like almost $20 million a year, including stock awards, which are actually part of compensation according to the tax. So that means that Amazon could be in a position of paying like $1 million in tax for just those two highly compensated employees. So I could totally see Amazon, threatening and trying to move people to Bellevue. I think the question is, how should we feel about that, or how should we respond to that? And for me, that really just underscores, like, this is a first move. This is not the end of the game. And if Amazon does that, then that just pushes us harder to do this kind of tax at a county level, at a state level, right? Like, of course they're going to try to move. We have to follow them. And one thing about the Jumpstart Seattle legislation is it does have language that says that if a higher level of government passes a very similar tax for similar purposes, Seattle would consider bumping Seattle's amount down. And that's, I was not a big fan of that language, but I do think it potentially helps with this dynamic, because if Amazon is trying to, move employees who maybe are continuing to work from home because of the pandemic, if they're trying to have them technically based in Bellevue, I think that, Seattle companies that cannot so easily relocate are actually going to then be allies in trying to get a big business taxes passed countywide or statewide to kind of level the playing field. So I guess what I'm saying is we're playing this kind of like cat and mouse game with Amazon and with like big capital. It's like, yeah, we tax them here, they're going to try to move, and then we have to tax them there. And that also goes kind of on a larger scale and a longer timeline nationally, right? And so if they're then trying to expand in other cities where they have a more favorable tax environment, well, we need to be working with movements in those other cities so that they're, having similar fights and not letting them get away with that. So that's just to say this is kind of a long-term thing, and like a really important and significant first step. And so now we just have to see how Amazon and others respond. So that's kind of what I have to say about tax landscape. Maybe I'll pause there. I can say a few other things about kind of progressive revenue, because I know there's been some discussion about, the state legislature doing things in their next session. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that, but maybe I'll just pause and in case people have questions or want to talk about the big business tax stuff for a few minutes.
That sounds good to me. And by the way, I wanted to say, is it cool with you, Katie, if we record this and release it out to the followers after the fact?
Yeah.
Cool. And if you ask a question, we have it on speaker view, but you'll briefly be on, just so you know. You can ask us in the chat if you're not comfortable with that, for those of you in the audience. But yeah, I think that would be good to talk a little bit more about that history too.
Did you want me to keep
Well, I got one question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I heard that the state legislature the state wasn't really going to run out of money until like January, so there wasn't going to be a special session, because a while back it sounded like there was going to be a special legislative session for sure.
I mean, from what I've heard, it seems likely that there will not be a special session, but the driving force behind that decision seems to be more political than anything else. And it's because so many legislators are up for election and they tend to not like to do special sessions so that they can focus on their campaigns. So it's actually really frustrating because they need to they need to do shit. So yeah, it's really annoying. I think there's still a possibility, but it would take a big push, I think, to get them to convene. I mean, the other danger is, of course, there's two pressures, right? So if they were to convene a special session, there's pressure to raise progressive revenue, which we like. There's also pressure to make cuts, and we don't want them to do that. So I don't know. Yeah. But at this point, it looks like there won't be one, which is stupid.
We have a few questions in the chat. Was it easier if we read them to you, or would you like to read them out and answer them?
Either way, I can read them.
Okay.
So let's see. Emily, where should we focus our efforts on lobbying for Washington state business tax? Also like to know more about Lewis's capital gains tax. Yeah. So I think, I think we, being primarily based in Seattle, should really focus our lobbying efforts on the Seattle delegation, right? And there's already tensions that have emerged between the city council and some legislators. So you might have seen that, like, Reuben Carlisle has been very public in opposition to Jumpstart Seattle and basically saying the city shouldn't be doing this, the state should do this. Jamie Peterson, I don't know what he said publicly, but he's probably kind of in the same territory. So those two are being, and especially Carlisle, are being really like really bad, basically. And because like, as far as I know, Carla has done like fuck all to actually get us progressive revenue at the state level. So for him to be like, oh, this should be done at the state level is like really bad. So, but we need, I mean, but at this point we should be like, okay, that's what you think. Well, like fucking act on it, right? So I think that really pushing all of the Seattle legislators to be aggressive champions for new progressive taxes and for an anti-austerity agenda in Olympia is where we should be focusing. I know that Joe Nguyen is really interested in championing a excessive compensation tax, basically, you know, kind of like what Seattle just passed in Olympia. I know Frank Chop, I mean, we'll see what happens to him, but he also has put forward a big progressive tax kind of suite of proposals, including an excessive compensation, big business tax. So I think, you know, I think things are going to move, and I think we have a big opportunity to really push them all. We should be pushing on big business, you know, excessive compensation tax, capital gains tax, maybe raising the estate tax. And frankly, I think the time is right to really get them start talking about an income tax. And, you know, that's something that the legislature has been very cautious on, as we all know. But really, like, I think so just to maybe take a tiny detour, you know, the state Supreme Court declined to review Seattle's tax on the rich, right? And they didn't explain that decision, but from people that I've talked to, kind of lawyers and people who maybe have some insight into what the Supreme Court was thinking, the message that I've heard is that they didn't want to review it because they saw it as the Seattle thing. And, you know, they're elected too, and they did not want to take the political heat for making this big momentous ruling on the basis of a tax that was just passed by the Seattle City Council. So what that tells me is that they're probably prepared to reverse those 1930s rulings that get in the way of us having a progressive income tax, but they need to hear it from the state as a whole. So they want either the state legislature to pass something or they want a statewide vote on something. So I think that, you know, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but I think really we need to get a statewide income tax. And maybe the way to do that is to make it a millionaire tax, right? Let's not fool around with saying, oh, progressive income tax, just tax millionaires. I think that's something that would be very popular. Of course, there would still be a big campaign against it, but I think that's probably the way forward on that front. Lewis's capital gains tax, I think he's backed off on that for now. He got, you know, he kind of didn't really consult with anyone before coming out with it. And it's not a bad idea, but I think what I've heard is that the organizations that do a lot of state level work on revenue and progressive taxation, they're worried that if the city were to move forward right now with a capital gains tax that then got litigated because the city would be sued, that is going to ruin the chances for the state to move forward in a bigger way on a capital gains tax, because no one's going to want to pass it while something's being litigated. So I think he's agreed to kind of hold off on that proposal until after the next legislative session to give the state legislature a chance to pass a bigger capital gains tax, which seems to me reasonable. Like, I don't think Lewis's proposal was bad, but it also wasn't going to raise that much money. It was like 30 or 40, maybe $30 million or something. So it's like, meh, let's let the state legislature have a go at that. Karen is asking, how much were you involved in shaping this actual legislation, as in the Jumpstart? Did you sit down and help craft it? Just curious. I guess it's okay, since you're recording this, for me to say this. Yes, I was very involved in crafting the actual legislation. Basically, this was kind of started in March, I guess, or early April. But it was basically early in the pandemic, and it had become clear that like the pandemic was really making it hard for the Tax Amazon campaign to gather signatures, which of course then picked up when the protest started, but we didn't know that was going to happen. And so we had some discussions within TRU about how, like, whether we could still actually get something passed, because Sawant and Morales put forward their council legislation for, you know, a 500 million big business tax, but it was really clear that they didn't really have support beyond those two council members. And so we made a decision within TRU that it made sense, like an alternative proposal was going to need to come out basically in order to pass. And so we ended up working, not just us, but others as well, but we ended up working with Mosqueda's office fairly closely. Basically, like we knew that TRU was going to have to make an independent decision about whether to support whatever came out of Mosqueda's office. And of course, we ended up pushing to make it bigger, et cetera. But I ended up doing a lot of work with her office on the legislation with the aim of making that proposal as big and good as possible. So yes, that's the answer to that question. Laura saying, what should we expect in terms of income tax support? Okay, I guess I already kind of talked about that a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think this is an opportunity to push on this. I think that, and if they don't start acting on it, like maybe we could do like a statewide initiative in 2022 or something like that for a millionaire tax. I don't know. That's just an idea. Okay, any updates on the legal challenge of okay, so you're talking about the initiative 976, the car tab fee thing. Other people may know more about this than I do. I think they heard arguments and they haven't made a ruling, although we're hoping to get a ruling in the next few months. Does anyone else know more about that? Okay.
I think that sounds right.
Okay.
The Supreme Court can do whatever they want, but yeah, I think they're expected to not drag their feet super long.
Yeah, and I'll talk, a little bit later. I'll talk a little bit more about the transit service, including the fall ballot measure. Or I could talk about that now. If that's what. Any other questions that aren't about transit?
Seems like a good segment. Okay,
so let's talk about transit funding then. So our transit system is really kind of fucked right now. If you haven't noticed, it's bad. And I don't have any numbers off the top of my head, but it's, hundreds of millions of dollars like this year that have been lost, both in fare revenue because of, Metro has not been collecting fares. Sound Transit just resumed collecting fares, extremely low ridership because of the pandemic, and also sales tax revenue, which continues to be the primary source of funding for operating our transit system, which is really bad. So we have this transit funding crisis. We've been propped up a little bit in the short term by money from the first federal stimulus package. And there's actually a push underway now to try to make sure that in whatever package is hopefully passed in the next few weeks, that there will be more funding for transit. And so you can expect, I think we're kind of working with Transportation Choices Coalition and some other organizations on some pushing that we can all do, because it's really our senators, Cantwell and Murray, who can help to make sure that transit funding is included in the package. But again, that would be like another one-time infusion. So that's not going to be like sustain our transit system for the long haul. And so the Seattle measure, I don't know how much knowledge to assume that people have of it, but basically the measure that is expiring this year was a 0.1% sales tax and $60 car tab fees that was passed in 2014. And because of Initiative 976, the car tab fees are kind of not politically viable. Like technically the city could still put them on the ballot and then they would only go into effect if the court case went our way, but it would be like super confusing and they just feel like that's not really a viable option. So the mayor has proposed just a 0.1% sales tax. So it would basically just be a partial renewal of the expiring measure. It doesn't raise a lot of money. The proposal spreads it out over a bunch of different buckets. Transit service doesn't get much, so it's pretty disappointing. But on the other hand, it's not really clear what the city could do to make it that much better. There was some talk of trying to get them to do a 0.2% sales tax instead, but that's more regressive taxes. And because the mayor really frustratingly left it to the last minute to transmit her proposal to council, there's just not a lot of time for all of us on the outside to decide what we want and to push for it. So we're all kind of under the gun trying to figure out, because this Friday, right, is when the city council is supposed to make whatever changes they're going to make. So yeah, so that's kind of the status of that. And I mean, for me, so what I've been trying to talk to people about is, I think one thing that we really need to push the state legislature on is to have more local funding options for transit, right? Because so the authority that Seattle is using for this measure is called the Transportation Benefit District. And so the state legislature has kind of defined what funding options the city or the county or Sound Transit are able to use to fund transit, and they're very limited. And so with the car tab fees kind of out of the picture for now, it's really sales tax, and there's oh, you can do a property tax, but you have to go to the ballot every single year. So it's just really that helpful. And there's a couple other things like developer impact fees, which the council could do, but that's not really a reliable revenue source for operating funds. That would be more for capital projects. So really, I think we need to push the legislature to expand that taxing authority so that we have some better options. And as to what those could be, I mean, frankly, I think that a payroll-based business tax is actually a really good way to fund transit, and it makes a lot of sense because ideally transit is taking people to work. But there could be other options, actually. Someone contacted me with this idea that they were thinking of in San Francisco called a transit assessment district, which is kind of properties are assessed based on some calculation of kind of the value that the value increase because of proximity to transit and transit infrastructure. And it's a fairly flexible tool because you can create exemptions or whatever in ways so if you're worried about worsening gentrification, you can kind of tailor it to minimize that impact. But then it ends up, I think, being a pretty progressive way to fund both transit infrastructure and operations. And the person who pitched it to me was he's kind of a transit consultant guy, and he was even pitching it as a way to just fund everything and go fare free. And oh, that sounds good. But we would need the legislature to authorize something like that. So I think there's opportunity there. But it's hard to get legislators' attention right now. So, but I mean, they're campaigning for office, so maybe now's the time. Okay, a couple questions here in the chat. I'm going to take the one about the transit assessment district first. Is that an ongoing annual assessment or a tax on sale of property? It would be an ongoing annual assessment. So it's it's not a property tax because it's not just based on total value of your property, but it's every year it would be assessed based on the value that was assumed to be added to your property or attributable to transit. And I haven't looked that deeply into it, so I have no idea how they do those calculations, but apparently they do. And San Francisco was going to put something like this on the ballot this fall, and then they chickened out because of COVID and stuff. But I think from some past attempts, they have kind of worked out some details, at least, of how this could work. And then Joanne is asking, how much should the rainy day fund be used temporarily to fill in until the future situation is better known? Yeah, that's a really good question, and no one knows the answer, right? Because, I mean, yeah, we don't know. I don't have an opinion on that. I think, I mean, Metro's probably being super cautious. They would always tend to be on the super cautious end, so maybe we should be pushing them to dip into it more than they would normally be inclined to. But yeah, we also don't know how long this thing's going to last or whether it's going to get worse. It is a rainy day. That's very true. It's the rainiest day. Yeah, let's see. What else is there to say about transit funding? I mean, we could talk a little bit about fares and fare enforcement. If people are interested in that.
There's also the ATU contract.
Oh yeah, that's something to mention so people are aware of it. That so the ATU had negotiated. So the ATU 587 represents the transit operators and mechanics, and they negotiated a contract earlier this year, and it was, I think, and their members, like, they finished the negotiations. It was after COVID had hit, and they did a vote of their members, overwhelmingly approved it. But now Dow Constantine wants to reopen negotiations because of, you know, the county's new financial situation. And the drivers are saying, hey, wait, we're essential workers who are putting our lives on the line. Like, don't take away our cost of living increase. And so the Transit Riders Union, we're supporting the drivers. I mean, obviously we're worried about the finances and the service cuts and all of that, but we just think that those things should not be taken out of the drivers who are actually putting their lives on the line, and a couple of them have died of COVID. And so the county council actually started discussing it today, and I believe is on their agenda for next Tuesday. So we might have some kind of action or something encouraging people to contact their county council members in support. But yeah, just email your county council member in support of the drivers. Okay, fare enforcement. So maybe I'll just give a tiny bit of background of the work that's been done so far. So God, I think this is zooming back to spring of 2018. There was an audit of King County Metro's fare enforcement program on their rapid ride system. And basically the King County Auditor's Office released this report that showed that, not surprisingly, fare enforcement was hurting. It focused on poor and homeless people. Basically, they didn't have great data on race, although they had like some sketchy data, kind of like very loose data on race, which showed, as you might expect, that it was also racially disproportionate. But the main finding was that the vast majority of people who were getting fare enforcement citations on rapid ride buses were homeless or housing insecure. And so there was kind of, you know, we kind of put out a press release about that, and we and others kind of made a stink, and so King County Metro called us in, you know, several organizations, and said, okay, we want to do something about this. Let's sit down. And so we worked with Metro over kind of the second half of 2018, and they basically agreed to make some pretty far-reaching changes to the way that fare enforcement happens on the rapid ride buses. And it's not, you know, perfect by any means, but basically they did a few really important things. One was they took the whole fare enforcement system out of the courts. So previously, if you got a ticket, it was issued by the courts, and if you didn't pay, the courts could sell that ticket onto collections. And so then you'd be in debt and have it on your record, and maybe you couldn't get an apartment. And then secondly, if you got several fare enforcement citations, that became a criminal misdemeanor. So you were getting a criminal charge just for not paying your fare. And then also, like, almost no fines were ever paid. It was like less than 3% of, maybe even 0.3%. I don't know. It was a tiny, tiny number of tickets that were ever paid by anyone. And if you wanted to contest a ticket, you actually had to travel up to the court in Shoreline in order to appear and argue against your ticket. So it was kind of a really bad system. And so they took it totally out of the court system. So now fare enforcement citations are handled in-house by Metro. They reduced the fine from $124 to $50, or $25 if you pay within 30 days. You can put that money on your ORCA card instead of giving it to Metro. If you qualify for a reduced fare program, you can just sign up for that, and then you don't have to pay anything. And you can do like 2 hours of volunteer work at a nonprofit instead of paying. So they're trying to like create ways for people to resolve citations that don't involve money, and there's no more court system, and they no longer call law enforcement if you don't have ID. So they're trying to kind of separate it from the criminal legal system. So Metro's been like, again, it's not perfect because things can still go south when you have that fare enforcement interaction, but it's way better than it was. And so we were in the middle of pressuring Sound Transit to make similar reforms when COVID hit. And Sound Transit was like very slowly beginning to budge, but they're just like a really frustrating agency with a really kind of law and order culture. And so it was really slow. But anyway, COVID hit, and then they all went fare free, and of course weren't doing fare enforcement. And so now we're in the stage where they're all starting to think about collecting fares again and how to resume fare enforcement. And so Sound Transit is the furthest along in the sense that they're now collecting fares again. And we had to kind of push because so they're not doing normal fare enforcement because they're trying in social distancing, but they're basically asking people to like hold up like an Orca card or a ticket or something like from afar, just as kind of like, oh yeah, you might have paid. And when they first came up with this proposal, their plan was that if someone couldn't hold up an Orca card or a ticket, that they would be kicked off the train. And we were like, no, that's no good. Because, that's just kind of like escalating things right away. And then if someone doesn't want to get off, then they're calling law enforcement. So we pushed back against that, and Sound Transit backed down. So now I believe what they're doing right now is they are asking people to hold up a card, or a ticket, but if they can't hold something up, then the fare enforcement officer is just saying like, okay, well, try to pay next time. So like, whatever, that's fine. But I think, we're trying to make sure that they don't resume normal fare enforcement. We would like them to not resume it at all, obviously, but at the very least until they make the same kind of reforms that Metro's making. And that's kind of in the works. Like there's some things they're proposing to do, but then they really don't want to take it out of the court system. Now they have this whole proposal about like using the community courts, but it's all really weird. And we're like, we don't want that. No courts. And so we're working with a few of the county council members have actually been really good on this and helping us with the Sound Transit Board. So like Joe McDermott and Claudia Balducci and Dave Up the Grove who are all on the Sound Transit Board, have been pretty good and active in trying to help us push these reforms on the rest of the board, which is like not very progressive at all. So they're working on something, but it's probably not going to be till like September, because Sound Transit Board also has not even figured out how to do public comment remotely. So they're having some like just democracy problems with their meetings. And so they're not going to take this up until probably September. So we're just going to keep pushing them to just not do normal fare enforcement, and we'll see how long we can hold them off. So that's kind of where Sound Transit's at. And then Metro is at this point hoping to resume fares in September. And this is not public yet. Actually, they're just like having discussions with a few organizations, and then they're going to broaden it out to more kind of stakeholders or something. But they're hoping to resume fares in September. And they want to go cashless. And this is cashless and ticketless. They want to just come back with just cards. And so we understand obviously like not wanting to have that as much kind of touching things as possible, but this raises a whole host of problems or things with people who are currently paying with cash, which is like a lot of people, or human services bus tickets. So those are kind of ongoing conversations. And but Metro's obviously they're not doing fare enforcement since there's no fares. I'll stop talking if people have questions and stuff.
I'm glad you brought up how frustrating Sound Transit has been on this. They have a new like equity arm or team or something. Have they been running this through that, or is they just like off doing their own thing?
So they have this new kind of, I forget what it's called, like equity and inclusion officer kind of role. So and the person who it's Jackie, what's her last name? Jackie Saint something. She's really great. And there's a few individuals in the agency that are really kind of good and trying really hard, but Peter Rogoff, head CEO dude, is really horrible, and then also just their whole like kind of security wing like the people who run that are just very kind of, you know, just they have this kind of military kind of attitude. I don't know, you might remember there was kind of this thing where there was like some emails that were made public where they were, their head of security was talking about how like it was during the snowstorm and how like the only people who would be riding transit during the snowstorm are the people who are like the homeless people who refuse to go to shelter, and so therefore, you know, they need to be like punished, so that because until it's more painful to stay the same than it is to change, you never change. Or I don't know, it was really horrible. So they just have some just like internal culture issues and just the kind of personal beliefs of
I just want to jump in.
Oh yeah.
As a bus driver that drove in the snowstorm out of the Bellevue Park and Ride at Eastgate and to downtown, the people that got on my bus during the snowstorm were little old elders going in an international district that refused to miss a day getting their shopping done. And there was like 3 folks that like were slipping and sliding, and they had their carts, and they got on my bus to go downtown to get their vegetables in the snow. And it was just, no one else was on my bus. It was a really great moment. So that guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, and sorry, I mean, he was referring specifically to like the only people who don't pay.
Yeah, I know. I'm not in Metro for a reason. There's a whole, I could tell a whole, yeah, it's not a great place.
Yeah, no, it's very frustrating. So I think the people who have been hired to kind of do equity stuff within Sound Transit are like, you know, very well intentioned and trying really hard, but they also just don't really have power, right? So they can make all the recommendations they want, but doesn't necessarily mean that it happens.
And I looked up the name, and it's Jackie Martinez Vasquez.
Okay, yeah.
And I did, and one of the meetings I attended, she gave a report on it. Was good. Hopefully they actually like operationalize that office rather than just have it be kind of.
Well, you know what's really frustrating for me is just like, okay, we've done all this work with Metro, and so Metro has this fare evasion program, which again is not perfect, but it's way better. And so why can't Sound Transit just contract with Metro and have it be the same people doing it, the same consequences for not paying, the same like ways of contesting your thing, which at this point for Metro, that's the other thing, is that like if you want to contest your ticket, you just have to call a number and talk to someone, and chances are they're going to be like, okay, we'll just scratch that off or whatever. So like, why can't Sound Transit just contract with Metro so it's the same? But they really don't want. I can't really figure out why, except that it's this kind of like tension between the agencies where they don't want to like feel like Sound Transit feels like Metro's kind of lording it over them, that they've done this and now Sound Transit hasn't. And so like distance to kind of like doing what the other agency has already done. It's like they want to design their own program. But of course the result for riders is that it's really, really confusing because it's different. And it's like, the most important thing is that it's the same. But it's really hard to get that.
And last I heard, they both use the same private contractor, which is
right. That's right. Yeah. So,
I don't know
so they're contracting. Yeah.
I don't know if they like go back and forth like the individual.
No, they don't. They don't go back and forth, and they're also. It's like they're contracting with Securitas, but like the. Like each agency actually has quite a lot of like detailed control over what they're actually doing day to day and everything. So it's not like, oh, we hire Securitas and then Securitas just takes care of it and they're just kind of doing it the same for both agencies. Like each agency is like different workers and different protocol and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and I mean, I keep trying to think whether there's some opening, like, I mean, it's like we would love just free transit, right? And before the pandemic started, we were in the middle of our Orca for All campaign, and you know the main goal of that was to get a Seattle law requiring that large employers pay for transit for their workers. And you know we kind of saw that as a step toward free transit because like already it's like half of fare revenue is coming from employer transit programs. And so we were hoping that like, okay, if we can get like more employers paying for transit for their workers, that kind of ups the percentage of the fare revenue that's coming from employers, then it becomes an easier leap to be like, well, why don't we just do an employer tax and make transit free for everyone? Because they're paying for it anyway. And so it'll just like be so much more efficient to just do a tax rather than have them pay for their individual employees. And it, you know, it won't be that much more expensive. Maybe for some of them, it'll be cheaper, right? And so we were thinking of it as this kind of political stepping stone to free transit. And I still think it could be like, and I think that we could probably take this campaign up again as soon as transit's a little bit more back to normal, because if you think about it, like the workers that, the workers that are going to be impacted most by this law and the employers are like lower wage workers, because they're the ones who are not currently getting transit passes from their employers. And it works out really well if you think about it with Jumpstart Seattle, because the business tax applies to payroll paid to high paid employees. And so this is almost like, it's kind of like not hitting the same employers. And so it makes it, it just makes it hard for them to argue like, oh, well, you just did this business tax. How can you ask us to pay for transit now? It's like, well, like, no, those are different ones. So I think we could take that up again. But anyway, I also just like, it just feels like with the transit funding crisis and the fact that the agencies have had to go fare free first for a time, like, I just wonder if there's some opening to get to free transit in a faster way. And I mean, it would definitely involve a lot of new revenue because, you know, even though fares are not a majority of the transit agency's operating revenue, they're like a significant chunk. So you're still looking at like, I think it's like 150 million a year for Metro and 100 million for Sound Transit. So like, that's a lot of service. But I don't know. I think it's worth thinking about.
And do you know, Katie, if there is a mechanism or if Orca for All type campaign could sort of obligate corporations to pay whether or not there's fares? Because I think to me, it seems like part of the paranoia about just not having enforcement is that they would lose all these corporate contracts if companies are saying, oh, well, they're not even enforcing anyway, so we don't need transit pass because, you know, then we'll just tell people to ride the bus anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you know, the way that we were conceiving of the campaign, it's basically like labor standards legislation. So it's requiring that employers provide this benefit to their workers. And there would be a few ways they could do that. Like, you know, they could sign up for Orca Passport, or they could, you know, do this or do that. Yeah, it would, I don't think there's a way that we can just get them to pay. If they're just paying, then it's a tax and it's a different thing. So I think that would have to be something separate. But I mean, yeah, it's good to make it a law so that they can't not do it because they see other people riding for free. I don't know.
Wouldn't hurt.
I see a couple of things in the comments about Sound Transit doesn't take Metro transfers. Vice versa, can the Sound Transit ticket be used to transfer to Metro? Yeah, I mean, Sound Transit has been really resistant, to taking transfers from Metro, because with basically with the Orca card, they have kind of an agreement about fare revenue sharing, so that based on where you tap, like part of the fare is going to Metro and part is going to Sound Transit. So I think part of their resistance to taking transfers, just that makes that more complicated, because how would they wouldn't be able to account for that. So Sound Transit feels like they wouldn't be getting fare revenue that they're owed if they accepted transfers, basically. And then the other thing is that Sound Transit also just would prefer that poor people don't ride, and tends to be poor people who use transfers most. Yeah, they could estimate the revenue sharing, but it's a nice excuse for them to not do it.
So Katie, you know, can we tie our Orca for All campaign into this cashless business? Because the more poor people have Orca cards, if they try to go cashless, the better, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, but I think also first we just need to think about what our position on this cashless business is, right? Because I think there's a huge problem in the sense that, like, my understanding is like 25% of Metro's fare revenue is from people still paying cash or something. Wow. And then there's the whole like human services ticket program, right? And so there's just like a lot of poor people who right now are either using human services tickets or they're using cash, like, and maybe not paying full fare, right? Maybe they're getting on the bus and they're putting $1 in and the driver's waving them on, right? And so if you're going cashless, I mean, I think we would have to insist that, at least for the foreseeable future, that basically means you're doing a fare optional system and you are welcoming people to ride even if they don't have a card. Because I do not see any way that they're going to be able to get cards into the hands of everyone who needs them. Even though there is this free annual transit pass program that, you know, we and others have fought for years, and that is supposed to be rolling out this fall, but it's going to be, it's only a first kind of wave this fall. So it's unclear, like, it's not a pilot, like it's the first stage of a full-fledged program, but it's not clear how many people are going to be able to get transit passes, especially since they're partnering with like a few service agencies, and including like DSHS, but I think DSHS does not have immediate plans to reopen their offices. So I think it was like CCS and a couple other, which is Catholic Community Services. So it's just not clear how fast they're going to be able to roll out this free transit pass program that will hopefully get free annual transit passes into the hands of lots of very low income people, but it's going to take time. And so in the meantime, like, if they're going cashless, then they better also just, yeah, it's got to be basically like, if you can pay and you have an Orca card, thank you. And if not, ride anyway.
So can the human services bus ticket situation be turned into loading an Orca card? Or is that?
I mean, that's kind of what this free annual pass program is trying to do, but starting with just a few service providers. I mean, yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's complicated. Yeah, I mean, they're thinking of lots of different options, but none of them are good.
We're getting a little low on time, so folks should hurry up and get their questions if they had more. But short of that, I suppose we could sort of pivot to the next fight, because we've talked a lot about stuff that's happening or is in motion. But I would mostly be curious to hear your thoughts about, like, you know, what are new opportunities in the horizon. I guess we could, I don't see anything coming in yet, so I guess we could kind of go there.
Okay. Well, actually, I want to say one thing.
Sure.
So we've been talking about money basically this whole time. And the other big money thing that's going is trying to defund the Seattle Police Department. And I'm not an expert on that, but one thing that I did hear today, because I was talking with someone who's involved in the Defund SPD kind of coalition, and they were saying that, so the mayor had that press conference a few days ago or something where she I think it was the same press conference where she was shitting on Jumpstart Seattle. And she was also like criticizing the council for trying to defund SPD. And so this person told me that apparently the council members all got like 4,000 emails after that press conference of people against the cuts. So that's just to say that even though, and I'm kind of talking as assuming that my audience is 100% in favor of defunding SPD by 50%, which may or may not be true, but if you are in favor of defunding SPD by 50%, even though there is now a supermajority of the council that has kind of publicly said that they're in favor of that, that doesn't mean that they're solid or that they're going to be able to do it, because they are getting hella pushback, basically. So now is a good time to email your council members and thank them for their commitments and tell them to follow through. I see a question. Have you heard of any Amazon response or secret meetings to Jumpstart? So the little bits that I've heard from Amazon or about Amazon, Amazon doesn't talk to me and I don't talk to them, is first of all, that it sounds like they're unlikely to run a referendum. I'm sure they thought about it, but I heard a rumor that, I think there's a number of factors at play, but I heard a rumor that there was maybe some polling a few months ago that showed that Amazon's not very popular right now, and that taxing big business is really popular. And so I'm guessing they are deciding that like they're not really a good public face of a referendum campaign, especially given how their contributions to the city council races backfired last fall. And I think that the way that the tax is structured, and also the work that Councilmember Mosqueda's office did to reach out to a lot of businesses that would be impacted and kind of neutralize them or even get their kind of tepid support, means that Amazon's really isolated. So if they were going to do a referendum, like they can't hide behind Dick's Burgers and do a Jemiah this time, right? So it'd really just be them. So I don't think they're going to do a referendum. And I've also heard, so I think it is likely that the city will be sued. And and one of the kind of pretexts on which to sue the city is to say that the tax unfairly targets Amazon, right? Because there's this higher, significantly higher, much higher tax rate for companies that have Seattle payroll over $1 billion. And we set that threshold like kind of intentionally to just be Amazon, or like maybe there's another company or two up there, but we don't think so. So it's kind of like, it really is targeting Amazon. And so, and you know, the mayor said this in this interview that like, oh, that they could sue because we're targeting a single company. Now, you know, working with Mosqueda's office, of course, they consulted the city lawyers about this, and the city lawyers were like, no, that's fine. So I don't think that that legal strategy is going to work, but it is a pretext for suing. And so what I've heard is that there is going to be a suit, but it's probably not going to, so it's going to be like about that. So it's kind of on Amazon's behalf, but it's not actually going to be Amazon bringing the suit. It's going to be some other businesses or some other people bringing the suit. So that's the rumor that I've heard. And maybe that's a decision because again, Amazon knows that they're not like the best public face for any of this. So they're trying to get other people to do their dirty work, but that's what I've heard. I also heard some tiny rumor about like, oh, they're not going to do a referendum, but sometime next year they're going to do an initiative to repeal the tax. I don't know.
As Doug mentioned, we're getting down towards the end. But I gave a poor introduction to the work that True does at the beginning. Would you like to talk more? Could you talk more about what you do and how people can support you and how people can get involved in some of your campaigns?
Sure. So yeah, so I mean, we've been around for about 8 years, and we started organizing kind of in 2011 when there was a prospect of bus service cuts. We, you know, obviously we've done a lot of work on public transit, especially on transit affordability and access kind of issues, but we've also obviously like broadened our focus to really lots of kind of urbanist issues, right? Including affordable housing and transportation more broadly and progressive taxation. So, and we're a membership organization, which is kind of what allows us to do all that stuff. Cause like, well, whatever our members want to do, we do. And so you can join the Transit Riders Union, become a member. We have, well, normally in normal times, we have monthly in-person membership meetings. We've been trying to do online meetings since COVID started. And I mean, so, you know, we were putting a lot of work into the big business tax campaign, especially after COVID kind of made us pause our Orca for All campaign. I don't know what we're going to be working on next, really. Because, you know, maybe we'll resume Orca for All. Obviously, there's all these transit funding issues and progressive funding stuff, work to be continued. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like the field's open, and there's obviously like, I don't know, this wave of evictions that everyone's expecting is like pretty terrifying. So like, I imagine that it'll probably impact a lot of our members too. And so we'll probably maybe think of doing something about that. But yeah, you should join it and then tell us what we should work on next.
I should also mention, I would try to recruit Katie to be a writer for the Urbanist, except she's already got a gig with Crosscut. So you can definitely check her out on Crosscut. Her columns are some of the smartest on Crosscut and always fun to read. We did get one last question if we want to squeeze it in. It's about bike shares. Did you want to share any thoughts about bike share?
Yeah, I mean, we have not, I mean, we've worked just like a little bit on bike share, but that's mostly just in the MASS coalition, Move All Seattle Sustainably Coalition, which we and the Urbanist and a number of other organizations are working together. So we haven't done really a lot of independent work on bike share. We do have, a lot of our members are disabled, some wheelchair users, and so there's definitely, issues with kind of conflict in space between bike share and people with disabilities trying to access sidewalks and things. So we've done a little work on kind of that aspect of it. And yeah, but I think we're generally supportive of all non-car modes of transportation. So yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much, Katie, for making time and for doing all this great advocacy. It's always it always feels like when we're collaborating with TRU that we get more done. And that's definitely a testament to all the good work your organizers and yourself are doing.
Well, thank you, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's been fun to talk about all this stuff, and really appreciate all the work that the Urbanist does to enrich our local news scene, which is in so much need of enrichment.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, have a good night, everyone. Enjoy the weather. There's still a little time. And we'll post up the video if you have any friends you want to share it with, probably tomorrow.
Great.
All right. See y'all
Thank you,
next
everyone.
month.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks, Katie.